Are you coming to meet me or should I take her with me? Just imagine for a second picking up your phone and hearing that exact phrase from your partner. It completely comes out of nowhere, right? And it's spoken in a voice that doesn't even sound like them, just absolutely dripping with anger. Now, this chilling question wasn't pulled from some Hollywood horror script. It was a very real, very terrifying phone call that set off a chain of events so bizarre it completely upended the lives of everyone involved.
Welcome to This Explainer. Today we're opening up a highly unusual investigative case file. This was actually submitted as an email to the Maroon Files by a young man named Rajat. It's a dark, deeply twisted paranormal mystery that uncovers a horrific, multi-generational family secret. So let's dive right in and unpack exactly what happened step by step using the clues provided directly in Rajat's own account. To start off, let's ground our narrative in reality. We've got our two main subjects here. There's Rajat, who was a B.Tech student living in Navi Mumbai, and his girlfriend, Roshni. Now, Roshni was originally from the city of Varanasi, but she was studying about 30 kilometers away from Rajat in Kalyan. They'd been dating for about 6 or 7 months. Honestly, they were just two ordinary students leading totally normal lives, often meeting up at a quiet, newly developed park in Kalyan. Everything was perfectly fine until it absolutely wasn't. The whole inciting incident kicks off in March of 2019. Rajat gets that terrifying, out-of-character phone call from Roshni that we just talked about. He's devastated. He's panicked by the sheer malice in her voice, so he hops right on his bike for a frantic 30-kilometer ride to Kalyan Park. When he finally gets there around 6 p.m., she's nowhere to be seen. He calls her, but no answer. Then, suddenly, he feels a hand on his back. He spins around, and it's Roshni. She just looks at him and says, "You're too late." But here's the crazy part. She has absolutely zero memory of ever making that sinister phone call. Now pay attention to the escalating pattern of Roshni's symptoms here, because this wasn't just some one-off weird afternoon. First, we have the blackout at the park. Then, a little later, during a hotel stay after their exams, Roshni gets this sudden, severe headache. She physically recoils from Rajat, hides in the corner of the bed, and just desperately demands to go home. Her overall health visibly starts to deteriorate, and all of this builds to the ultimate climax of our story, the villa possession. But before we get to that, we really need to look closer at what actually happened at that park. If we backtrack to that evening in Kalyan Park, right after Roshni startled Rajat, they actually sat down and talked for about 20 minutes. But as the sun started to set and it got dark, Roshni violently pushed Rajat away. She started staring blankly into the empty space right behind him, almost like she had spotted someone or something. She grabbed him and whispered, "Listen, let's get out of here. I don't like it here." But get this, by the time they reached a nearby restaurant, Roshni had zero memory of her panic. It was a massive red flag that some supernatural presence within her was reacting to something unseen in that specific location. Okay, we all have that one family member nobody talks about, right? Well, earlier on, Roshni had casually mentioned a deceased great-aunt back in Varanasi who wasn't just a distant relative. She was a strictly forbidden topic. Like, literally no one in her family was allowed to speak of her. Rajat hadn't really thought much of it at the time, but as it turns out, this dark family secret was the absolute key to the entire mystery. As Roshni's health issues keep dragging on, she travels back home to Varanasi to get some rest. While she's there, she tells Rajat over the phone about a sudden freak accident. Her grandfather was visiting a construction site when a massive stone plummeted from the building above and severely injured his shoulder. It narrowly missed his head, a few inches over, and it would have been a fatal blow. Keep this specific detail in your back pocket because, as we're going to see very soon, this was definitely no accident. And that brings us to the next major phase of this case, the villa confrontation. Roshni eventually returns to Kalyan, and Rajat books a private villa so they can spend some quality time together. Over dinner, Rajat just casually asks, "Hey, did you find out anything about your aunt?" The reaction is instantaneous and explosive. Rajni completely switches off the music, drops her food, and walks over to Rajat, staring at him with this frightening, unfamiliar intensity. Thinking he's just upset her, Rajat stands up to give her a hug, but the absolute second he touches her, she shoves him with this unnatural, violent force, sending him crashing hard into the wall. Realizing something is deeply, deeply wrong, Rajat's reflexes kick in. He pulls out his phone and hits play on the Hanuman Chalisa, a Hindu devotional hymn. The very moment the audio fills the room, Roshni freezes perfectly still. With the audio paused, Rajat issues a desperate warning. "Whoever you are, get out of here or I'll play it again." And then, from the frozen body of his girlfriend, a voice that is completely not her own replies with this absolutely terrifying statement,
I've come from Benares especially for you." The entity then calmly sits down in front of a terrified Rajat, introduces herself as the forbidden great aunt, and promises she won't hurt him. She says she just needs to tell him a story. So here is the horrific history this spirit lays out. In her youth, the aunt fell deeply in love with a man named Anand. But because Anand was from a lower caste, her family fiercely rejected the match. So they did what a lot of people do. They eloped. A year later, they had a beautiful daughter named Shagun. Eventually, though, missing her family, the aunt called her father, who warmly invited them all back to Benares. But guys, it was a trap. On their third day home, Anand was brutally murdered by her father with a sword. When the aunt ran to help him, she was struck over the head with an iron rod by her own brother. The family assumed she was dead, and they actually buried her alive in the backyard. It is just an unimaginably horrific betrayal. But there's a huge dangling thread in this gruesome story. While this slaughter was happening out back, the aunt's 6-month-old infant daughter, Shagun, was still sitting inside the living room with her grandmother, completely unaware. She survived the night. Which brings us to the most shocking revelation of this entire explainer. Here is the dark, horrifying truth. The entity looks right at Rajat and explains that Roshni is not her niece. Roshni is Shagun. She is her daughter. The spirit possessing Roshni at that very moment is actually her own murdered mother, who has been fiercely clinging to her child's side ever since she suffocated in the dirt behind her family home. The family had constructed this elaborate, sickening lie to hide their monstrous crimes. You see, the mother's vengeful spirit began haunting the grandfather and the uncle, terrifying them daily. So the family called in a priest. To sever the spiritual connection, they performed a ritual and completely erased the child's identity. Little Shagun was renamed Roshni, and in a really twisted turn of events, she was then raised by the very uncle who helped murder her parents, manipulated for her entire life into believing he was her actual father. The mother's spirit then pieces everything else together for Rajat. Remember that incident at Kalyan Park? The sudden blackout? The fear? It turns out that specific park was built on a site where numerous murders had occurred in the past, and it was literally crawling with dark entities. The mother's spirit had taken control of Roshni's body that night to forcefully push Rajat out of the park and protect her daughter from the malicious spirits lurking in the dark. So, what does this spirit actually want? Well, she's driven by a few intense, unresolved motives. Her primary goal, of course, is protecting Roshni at all costs. But she is also driven by pure, unadulterated vengeance. Remember that falling stone that almost killed the grandfather at the construction site? The spirit proudly admits that wasn't an accident at all. She threw it, and she is furious that he survived. She also confessed she desperately wants to kill the uncle, but the priest gave him a powerful amulet that's currently shielding him from her attacks. Before finally releasing her grip on Rajni's body, the spirit of the murdered mother looks at Rajat and extracts a sullen promise. She forces him to swear that he will always keep her happy. Terrified and completely overwhelmed, Rajat immediately promises. The spirit recedes, and Rajat snaps right back to reality, acting completely normal, utterly unaware of the tragic history of her own life and the ghosts of her mother living inside her. And that brings us to the aftermath. The factual timeline actually ends relatively peacefully for our two students. Rajat and Roshni ended up breaking up amicably after the lockdown in 2021. Today, Roshni is newly married and living a happy, normal life, still entirely oblivious to her true identity. So, you might be wondering, why did Rajat submit this highly sensitive email to the Maroon Files? He did it as a chilling warning. He's hoping that by releasing the story into the public space, Roshni's grandfather and uncle will somehow hear it. Which leaves us with this final, incredibly unsettling thought. A family in Varanasi is currently living a massive lie, hiding a brutal murder, completely unaware that their victim is actively hunting them. Will the grandfather realize the spirit is still coming for him? And without that amulet to protect him, when will the murdered mother finally take her revenge? It's a dark, terrifying curse that remains active to this very day. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and I'll catch you next time.